When I was a kid growing up, we used to come to the second service. And the second service on Kol Nidre is very special because it's really late at night. Really late. I mean, you're here 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I mean, who's ever in shul that late? Except for maybe a party. But we would be at the back when I was a kid growing up, and it was during the time when Rabbi Meyerowitz was the rabbi here. And I remember that on Kol Nidre, his wife, Robin Sack-Meyerowitz, used to tell stories. Maybe some of you remember these? A lot of times, yes, okay, phew. A lot of times she would tell Hasidic stories. I don't know any Hasidic stories. I only know baseball stories, so I'm going to tell you a baseball story. It's about a story that I took involving a baseball trip. And in last week, when we were together on Rosh Hashanah, we read from the Torah two very interesting stories, two characters who had epiphanies, who at the end of their journeys, something they hadn't seen before, they looked up and they noticed. Remember? We had Hagar on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. She was in the desert. She was in the wilderness. She thought she was going to die. Her son Ishmael was going to die. And then after she was comforted by the angel from God, she looked up and she saw a well of water. Hope. The second day we read about Abraham. After this mysterious journey he goes on without any fighting, ostensibly to sacrifice his son to a place that God will show him on the way. At the end of that journey, after everything they've been through and his son is spared and he passes the test, he looks up and he sees a ram. Okay, good. I heard a couple of people in the front. They're playing along, but there are no points, so I apologize. I myself, 10 years ago, had a very similar story where I looked up and I saw something for the first time. And it was on a trip that I took 10 years ago in 2008. Many of you may know this, some of you don't, so I'll fill you all in. It had been a childhood dream of mine since I was a little kid to go on a journey. I'm a big baseball fan, to visit all of the stadiums in Major League Baseball. My mom would say that I have to say stadia, but I think we can all agree. Stadiums. 30 stadiums. And I had to plan the whole thing out. It was 2.5 months. I didn't have a car. I had to do this I discovered Southwest Airlines, trains, buses. I got rides from people. I stayed with people. I had to keep my costs down. It was an adventure, 2.5 months. But before I left, I had to plan the whole thing out. I had to make a detailed itinerary. I had to go through the map. I got to know the schedules of all these teams very well, and I got to look at a map, and I had to figure out how am I going to get from place to place, and they have to be there, the teams have to be there. It took a lot of planning, and I had a route. It doesn't matter if your geography is not so great, but the idea was from Winnipeg, I went straight south and hit all the cities along the way. I popped over to the East Coast in Florida. I worked my way up the East Coast, and then by the time I got through to St. Louis, I crossed over to the west, and I finished off on the West Coast. That was the plan. I was to start in Winnipeg, go to Minneapolis, and finish in Seattle 2.5 months later. While I was away on the trip, which was amazing, unfortunately, my grandfather, my Zedek, who I'd known was sick before I left, and I was hoping was going to make it to the end of the trip, but I didn't think he would, he passed away. And it was when I was in Florida, about a month, 3 weeks into my trip. And it meant that coming home for the funeral, I missed going to Cincinnati. Now, if any of you has been to Cincinnati, and I know there are people who even have relatives in our congregation in Cincinnati, Cincinnati is not the first place you would think of to go in the United States. It's not. It's just not the first place I don't think you would go, even if you're a big fan of WKRP or maybe things like that. I don't think that's happening. The other thing you probably don't know about Cincinnati is it's a hub for Delta Airlines, and it's very difficult to get to, even from within the United States. I missed Cincinnati because of the funeral. I hit all the other cities, and I resumed the trip after Cincinnati with Toronto, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, St. Louis, and then I was west. And when I went west, there was no way I could get back to Cincinnati. By the end of the trip, I got to Seattle, but I still had this one city where I had not been able to go. So my wife, my girlfriend at the time, Heather, she says, you know, Cincinnati's not that far from Toronto, where she was living in the summer, in between school semesters. She said, I bet you we could rent a car, get a car for my parents. We could drive down to Cincinnati from Toronto. Great idea. It's 8 hours. We did this. We stayed overnight in Cincinnati, and it was really great to finish off the trip together. We saw the last game together, which was really cool. For the most part, I did this trip alone, but it was a very special thing. At the time, I didn't know, or maybe I did, that Heather and I would end up together, but it was something very special early in our relationship for us to share. The best part is, after the game, you see, before every game on this trip, I like to get to the stadiums early, and I used to like to try and walk around and see everything. We didn't have time in Cincinnati because the weather was kind of poor. We weren't sure if it was going to rain, which would have been terrible. It didn't, but we didn't leave the hotel. And we just got to the game just in time for the game. So after the game, I said, I know it's dark, but I really want to kind of walk around the stadium. Not part of the plan, but we went. So we're walking around the stadium, and it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago. It was a very surreal moment to have finished this trip, something that I'd wanted to do when I was first a little kid with my Zeta, and then here I was doing it in honor of my Zeta. And as we turned the last corner coming around the stadium, not expecting much, I looked up, and on the side of the stadium in Cincinnati, of all places, they have words, big block letters lit up at night on the side of the stadium. And they chose to immortalize the longtime radio announcer and his send-off, his calling card, his call, a guy named Joe Nuxall, who wasn't much of a ball player, but was a Cincinnati legend. And what are those words that I look up and I see? He's rounding third and heading for home. In Cincinnati, of all places. Amazing. If I'd finished the trip in Seattle, none of this would have happened. But Cincinnati, and this amazing moment where I looked up, and something that I hadn't noticed from our hotel room or seen in pictures, rounding third. He's rounding third and heading for home. Joe Nuxall's favorite call. So it's a great story. And a lot of you are saying to yourselves, what does this have to do with Yom Kippur? When you think about the kinds of wrongdoings that we've just listed, the Talmud classifies them into three categories, and we've seen these words in Hebrew: avon, pesha, and chet. Avon, pesha, and chet. We know chet the best from al chet. Avon, pesha, and chet. But it's very interesting what the Talmud says about each of these three. Avon is a twisting, literally twisting off the correct path, usually by temptation. Then you have pesha. Pesha is a rebellion, rejecting God's path. And then you have chet, literally missing the mark, like when you shoot an arrow at something or when you throw a ball at a target, missing the mark because of forgetfulness or ignorance. All three of the kinds of wrongdoings that we deal with at this time of year have to deal with going off course. Because when I think about my Cincinnati story, it could be about seeing signs. It could be about everything always works out for a reason, which I don't even like the sound of, and it's not really what I think of. I think of going off course. And the fact that I had planned that trip so perfectly, and here I was at the very end, needing to get to Cincinnati. But in the end, I had to go to Cincinnati. Is the course, going off course. And that's what each of those things is all about. Avon, pesha, and chet. In one way or another, being on a path of straight virtue and going off, either because of temptation or rebellion or simply forgetfulness or ignorance. Regardless the reason, you're off the path. In the trips that I've taken since my baseball trip in the last 10 years, I've learned, which is difficult for my personality, that no amount of planning will ever prevent from the fact that at some point you're going to go off course. Anyone who's gone on any kind of trip of any kind of magnitude, even small ones, knows. You plan, you try your best, but inevitably, certain things are out of your control and you will go off course. To make it seem, to fit it into Yom Kippur, we're all making our plans for the next year, and we all want to be on the straight path, the righteous path, the virtuous path. But we're all going to sin. That's what Kol Nidre is all about. Acknowledging there are going to be things we say today that we won't even remember, that we may break. We anticipate the fact that we are going to do wrong. The whole point is, what do you do when you go off course? What do you do when you sin? What do you do? How do you react? Do you run away like Jonah, who we'll read about tomorrow? Or do you face your sins? Self-examination, the kind of reflection that Yom Kippur teaches us to have. Do you face the people you've wronged? Look them in the eyes. Do you look yourself in the mirror and think about the ways you've wronged yourself or maybe God? Miles Davis always said, there's no such thing as wrong notes. You don't play a wrong note. It's the note you play next that makes it right or wrong. It's the way you react to adversity, to the problems you create, to the problems you face, to your sins that defines you. It's the places where you go off course in life where you actually discover way more about yourself when you stay on course. Going off course, being human, sinning, is actually where we can realize what we need to work on the most. It's when you go off course, like Hagar did, like Abraham did, like I did, that you have your aha moments, the moments when you look up and you see what you hadn't seen before, a new perspective. That is what tshuva, a return, is all about. And so I want to leave you tonight with a message that hopefully will guide you through our services tomorrow. That in this next year ahead, each one of us will sin. Each one of us will go off course. But it's the way we deal with what we did wrong that will define us. And next year, we'll be back here together again, God willing, beating our chests and talking about all the sins we've committed in this past year. But hopefully there won't be any repeats. Hopefully we will grow and we will learn. And we will allow these moments where we go off course to be epiphanies for us. It's the going off course, it's the sins that allow us to round third and head for home. Shana Tova, Gamar Chatima Tova.